Hi, it is All In by Mark Batterson. This is chapter 9 called Climb the Cliff. 1 Samuel 14, verse 2. Saul was staying on the outskirts of Geba under a pomegranate tree in Migron. With him were about 600 men. I was recently on a transatlantic flight from Ethiopia to D.C. I got tired of reading right around the time we passed the Rock of Gibraltar, so I watched a film called We Bought a Zoo. Based on a true story, Matt Damon plays the role of a British writer, Benjamin Mee, who rescues a failing zoo while coming to terms with his life as a widower and a single father. One line from the film is unforgettable. Sometimes all you need is 20 seconds of insane courage. That's not just a great line from a well-written screenplay. It can change the plot line of your life. 20 seconds of insane courage. That's all it took. That's about how long it took for Peter to get out of the boat in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. That's about how long it took for David to charge Goliath. That's about how long it took for Zacchaeus to climb the sycamore tree. History turns on a dime, and the dime is a defining decision. That takes about 20 seconds of insane courage. But if you have the courage to take that one step of faith and climb the cliff, it will change your life forever. That's about how long it took for me to surrender my life to Jesus Christ. That's about how long it took for me to call Laura to ask her out on our first date. That's about how long it took me to say yes to a church plant in Washington, D.C. 20 seconds of insane courage. That's all it takes. What difficult decision do you need to make? What tough conversation do you need to have? What crazy risk do you need to take? Holy crazy. Sometimes one snapshot of one moment of one person's life is a character of a person's entire character. This is the moment for Saul. Can't you see Saul snacking on seeds while reclining in the shades of a pomegranate tree? I'll bet some of the lowest-ranking privates were even fanning him. And instead of picking a fight with the enemy, the leader of Israel's army is picking pomegranates. And it shouldn't come as a surprise. Saul had a long history of letting others fight his battles for him. Saul was a rim hugger. But his son, Jonathan, is anything but. Jonathan is a cliff climber. Their polar opposite approach to the very same situation is so dramatically different that it's hard to believe they even come from the same gene pool. Saul was playing not to lose. Jonathan was playing to win. And that's the difference between fear and faith. If you let fear dictate your decisions, you will live defensively, react cautiously, and live by playing offense with your life, and it's the difference between holding out on God and going all out for God. 20 seconds of insane courage. I can't think of a better description than Jonathan picking a fight with the Philistines. It was crazy, but if God is in it, it's wholly crazy. Don't be surprised if people mock you, criticize you, and laugh at you when you do something crazy. In fact, if you aren't being criticized, it's cause for concern. Get over it and get on with it. People may think you're crazy when you climb a cliff, but the only other option is for them to think you're normal. Do you want to be normal? Is that your aspiration or inspiration? Me neither. Call me crazy, but normal is the last thing I want to be. I'm sure that the other 11 disciples would periodically make flailing motions to Peter, mocking him for sinking in the Sea of Galilee, but they never walked on water, did they? Have you ever noticed how most people who criticize water walkers do so from the comfortable confines of a boat? And most people who criticize cliff climbers do so from low elevations. David's brother criticized him for challenging Goliath, but David made headlines when his brother sat on the sidelines. And I'm sure the crowd got a kick out of a tax collector climbing a tree to get a glimpse of Jesus, but they didn't get invited to lunch with Jesus. So what motivated Jonathan to climb that cliff? What triggered the 20 seconds of insane courage? What quelled his fear? Let me set the scene. During the early days of Saul's kingship, the Philistines controlled the western border of Israel, and battle lines were drawn at the pass called Michmash. Saul seemed content to sit on the sidelines, but Jonathan wanted to be on the front line. Come, let's go over to the Philistine outpost on the other side. Going all out for God always starts with one step of faith. It's often the longest, hardest, and scariest step. But when we make a move that is motivated by God's glory, it moves the heart and the hand of God. There comes a moment in our lives when enough is enough. The pain of staying the same is greater than the pain of change. We reject the status quo. We refuse to remain the same. This is that moment for Jonathan. The New Living Translation captions it, Jonathan's daring plan. To be perfectly honest, it seems like a dumb plan. It has to rank as the worst military strategy ever. Jonathan exposes himself to the enemy in broad daylight and concedes the high ground. And then he comes up with this sign to determine whether or not to engage the enemy. But if they say, "Come up to us," we will climb up, because that will be our sign that the Lord has given them into our hands. Well, if I'm making up the signs, I do the exact opposite. If they come down to us, that'll be our sign. Or better yet, if they fall off the cliff, that will be our sign. Jonathan chooses the most difficult, dangerous, and daring option that exists. But that's why I love it. When did we start believing that Jesus died to keep us safe? He died to make us dangerous. The will of God is not an insurance plan. It's a daring plan. I'm not sure which was more dangerous, climbing the cliff or fighting the Philistines. There was no guarantee that Jonathan would even survive the climb. It's not like the Philistines dropped a rope, and even if he made it to the top, Jonathan and his armor-bearer were outnumbered 10-1. I went rock climbing once, and my hands were clenched in a claw-like position for several hours afterward. Can you imagine a sword fight after climbing a cliff? But what a picture of what All Out is all about. It's not looking for the easy way out. It's an all-out assault. It's not taking the path of least resistance. It's committing to the path of greatest glory, and that usually means the most difficult and dangerous option available. It is the difference between letting things happen and making things happen. But Jonathan knew that if he pulled off this against all odds upset, God would get all the glory. So what motivated Jonathan? What triggered the 20 seconds of insane courage? What quelled his fear and fueled his faith? What gave him the good, old-fashioned guts to climb the cliff? It's impossible to psychoanalyze someone who lived thousands of years ago, but one statement reveals Jonathan's MO. It is the key code in his operating system, and it's one of my favorite sentences in all of Scripture. In fact, it is the philosophy of ministry at National Community Church. One statement reveals everything I need to know about Jonathan. Perhaps the Lord will act in our behalf. I think most people operate out of the opposite mentality. Perhaps the Lord won't act on our behalf, and they let fear dictate their decisions instead of faith. And so they end up under a pomegranate tree on the outskirts of Gibeah. Our lack of guts is really a lack of faith. Instead of playing to win, we play not to lose. But cliff climbers would rather fall on their face than sit on their butt. They would rather make mistakes than miss opportunities. Cliff climbers know that one step of faith can create a tipping point that changes not only their destiny, but the course of history. And that is precisely what happened in the wake of Jonathan's bold move. And so on that day, the Lord saved Israel. All it took was one daring decision. That's all it ever takes. Jonathan's cliff is like Alice's rabbit hole. If you don't go down the hole or climb the cliff, you never know what would have happened. I don't want to wonder what if. The longest regrets are the inaction regrets. The things we would have, could have, or should have done but did not do. Why? Because you'll never know. Those regrets will haunt you till the day you die. But this day could be that day. And all it takes is one defining decision. I recently spoke at a college commencement, and let me share the manifesto I shared with them. It's about going all in and going all out for God. Quit living as if the purpose of life is to arrive safely at death. Set God-sized goals. Pursue God-ordained passions. Go after a dream that is destined to fail without divine intervention. Keep asking questions. Keep making mistakes. Keep seeking God. Stop pointing out problems and become part of the solution. Stop repeating the past and start creating the future. Stop playing it safe and start taking risk. Expand your horizons, accumulate experiences, enjoy the journey. Find every excuse you can to celebrate everything you can. Live like today is the first day and the last day of your life. Don't let what's wrong with you keep you from worshiping what's right with God. Burn sinful bridges. Blaze new trails. Don't let fear dictate your decision. Take a flying leap of faith. Quit holding out. Quit holding back. Go all in with God. Go all out for God. I like that. Pick a fight. I have a friend, George Goff, who is full of whimsy. That's a nice way of saying he's crazy. And Bob would be the first to admit it, to celebrate it. If you haven't read his book, Love Does, you need to. We had dinner one night after he spoke at National Community Church, and Bob challenged us to take over a country. He wasn't kidding. With a grin, he said, "Why not?" And why wouldn't Bob challenge us after the way God used this one man to impact the nation of Uganda? More on that in a moment. There are two kinds of people in the world, those who ask why and those who ask why not. Going all out is asking why not. Why people look for excuses. Why not people look for opportunities. Why people are afraid of making mistakes. Why not people don't want to miss out on God-ordained opportunities. I first met Bob at National Prayer Breakfast in Washington, D.C. He was on a panel dealing with human trafficking. And through a crazy confluence of events that only God could have orchestrated, Bob was named honorary consul for the Republic of Uganda to the United States, and he's a U.S. citizen. Go figure. Much of Bob's work in Uganda involves fighting for those who cannot fight for themselves. Every year, witch doctors kill hundreds of children as ritual sacrifices. A little boy named Charlie was supposed to be one of them, but despite being brutally disfigured, he managed to escape with his life. Bob prosecuted and got the very first conviction against a witch doctor in the history of the country. He also became friends with Charlie. He flew Charlie to the U.S. where he could get surgical intervention he needed and secured a scholarship so Charlie could get a college education when that day arrives. It was during the panel discussion that Bob made an offhanded comment that has become a personal mantra. Pick a fight. That single statement stirred something deep within my soul. That's exactly what Jonathan did. He decided to pick a fight with the Philistines. He was tired of backing down, so he stood up. He was tired of playing defense, so he decided to go on the offense. He was tired of settling for the status quo, so he decided to disrupt it. How do we pick a fight? It starts when we get on our knees. Prayer is picking a fight with the enemy. It's spiritual warfare. Intercession transports us from the sidelines to the front lines without going anywhere, and that is where the battle is won or lost. Prayer is a difference between us fighting for God and God fighting for us. But we can't just hit our knees. We also have to take a step, take a stand. And when we do, we never know what God will do next. So here's the rest of the story. After getting the conviction against the witch doctor, Bob visited him in prison. That witch doctor gave his life to Jesus Christ and is now preaching the gospel to other prisoners. That's what can happen when we pick a fight with the enemy. It's not about winning a battle. It is about winning them over. Play offense. I think we conveniently forget that we were born in the middle of a battle. The cosmic battle between good and evil rages all around us, and yet we live like it's peacetime. 2,000 years ago, Jesus rallied the troops and sounded the charge with a call to spiritual arms. I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. Gates are defensive measures. That means, by definition, that we're called to play offense. Faithfulness is not holding the fort. It's storming the gates of hell and taking back enemy territory that belongs to God. I'm afraid we've reduced righteousness to the absence of wrongness. But goodness is not the absence of badness. You can do nothing wrong and still do nothing right. Remember the parable of the bags of gold? Breaking even is bad. You've got to ante up everything. We don't just sit still for very long at National Community Church. We're always thinking about what's next. We have a little motto that has become part of our mindset. Go, set, ready. That may seem backward, but it's the way we keep moving forward. If we wait till we're ready, we'll be waiting the rest of our lives. We'll never have the human resources or the financial resources to do what God has called us to do, and if we do, our dream is too small. 2,000 years ago, Jesus said, go. We've been given a green light to go for it. Do you need to make sure it's the will of God? Of course you do. But don't let seeking the will of God be the cop-out that keeps you from going all out. I don't think that multi-site is the only way or necessarily the best way to do church. But one reason I love the multi-site methodology is that we don't get too comfortable for too long. We're always looking for the next God-ordained opportunity. It keeps us on the offensive organizationally. I try to live my personal life the same way. That's why I'm a big believer in life goals. We won't accomplish any of the goals we don't set. Goals are dreams with targets on them. And once we set them, it keeps us on the offensive. If you want to see my life goal list, check out the Circle Maker. Along with my 113 life goals, I share 10 steps to setting life goals. Face your fears. A few months ago, I had coffee with a Washington, D.C. council member. I wanted to get his pulse on the greatest needs in our city to see how we as a church could help meet them. We had a great conversation that ranged from fatherlessness to homelessness. At the end of our conversation, I asked this council member if I could pray for him. He had just decided to throw his hat into the D.C. mayoral race, so I knew he was feeling the pressure of politics at an all-new level. And when he didn't give me an answer right away, I wondered if I had offended him. But his profound, honest response was the result of some serious introspection. He looked me in the eye and said, "Pray that I don't let fear dictate my decisions." If the election had been held right then, he would have gotten my vote. We let many different things dictate our decisions, don't we? In the town where I live, decisions are often made on the basis of opinion polls instead of moral principles. But all of us are subject to pride, lust, anger, and jealousy. Those dictators often affect our decisions in subconscious ways, but the worst dictator is fear. It governs through intimidation, and the largest Philistine among them is the fear of failure. Failing at my first church plant attempt was both horrible and wonderful. It was a death blow to my ego, but that's what set me free. I discovered that failure is not the end of the world. God was right there to pick me up and dust me off. Failure is not the enemy of success. It is the greatest and closest ally. We treat failure and success like they're not antonyms. Failure is part of every success story. Think of it as the prologue. You have to choose a dictator. You can't let fear dictate your decisions, or you can let fear dictate your decisions. I'm going to repeat that again. You have to choose a dictator. You can let fear dictate your decisions, or you can let faith dictate your decisions. Whom or what you allow to dictate will ultimately determine whether you're a rim hugger or a cliff climber. Better safe than sorry. It's important to make a distinction between personality issues and spiritual issues. I realize we all have a different risk threshold. Some people seem to be wired for risk while others aren't. And a small risk for someone with a low tolerance for risk is a huge risk for him or her. All of us land at different places on the risk spectrum, but just because you aren't a natural risk taker doesn't mean you get an exemption because of personality. Think of it this way. There are spiritual gifts like mercy, faith, and generosity that enable people to set the standard, so to speak. But just because you don't have the spiritual gift doesn't mean you aren't held to any standard at all. Even if you aren't gifted in that way, you're still called to live mercifully, faithfully, and generously. You might not set the standard, but you need to meet the standard. There is a baseline that all of us are called to. And when the opportunity presents itself, we need to show mercy, exercise faith, and give generously. In the same sense, all of us are called to take risk. If it doesn't involve risk, it doesn't exercise faith. A parapsychologist from the University of Michigan conducted a fascinating study a decade ago that reframed the way I think about fear. Volunteers wore an electrode cap that enabled researchers to analyze brain activity in response to winning and losing during a computer-simulated betting game. With each bet, the medial frontal cortex showed increased electrical activity within a matter of milliseconds. But what intrigued the researchers was the medial frontal negativity showed a larger dip after a loss than the rise in medial frontal positivity after a win. Researchers came to the same yet profound conclusion. Losses loom larger than gains. In other words, the aversion to loss of a certain magnitude is greater than the attraction to gain of the same magnitude. Maybe that helps explain why so many people play not to lose. It's our neurological default setting. We fixate on the sins of commission instead of sins of omission. And maybe that's why we approach the will of God with a better safe than sorry mentality. I think most of us are far too tentative when it comes to the will of God. We're so afraid of making the wrong decision that we make no decision. And no decision is a decision. It's called indecision. Take a stand. On October 31st, 1517, A monk named Martin Luther picked a fight with the religious establishment. He had the audacity to challenge the status quo by attacking the selling of indulgences. Luther posted 95 of these on the doors of All Saints Church in Wittenberg, Germany, and ignited the Protestant Reformation. I had the privilege of visiting Wittenberg a few years ago on Reformation Day. What's amazing to me is the way a little-known monk in a tiny hamlet in the middle of nowhere could impact history the way he did. And that's what happens when you go all in. I don't think Martin Luther knew he was making history as he made history. But our small acts of courage have a domino effect. When we do what's right, regardless of circumstance or consequences, we set the table for God to turn the tables. And all we need to do is stand up, step in, or step out. At the Diet of Worms in 1521, Martin Luther was summoned by the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V and put on trial for his beliefs. Instead of recanting, Martin Luther mustered the moral courage to take a stand. My conscience is taken captive by God's word. I cannot and will not recant anything. For to act against our conscience is neither safe for us nor open to us. On this day I take my stand. I can do no other. God help me. Amen. Let me bring this a little closer to home. Whom do you need to stand for? The homeless? The fatherless? The voiceless? It may feel like an overwhelming problem or challenge or dream. But don't let what you cannot do keep you from doing what you can. Take the first step. Climb the cliff. Pick the fight. Perhaps the Lord will act on your behalf. And that's the end of chapter 9.